fireside chats is the term used to describe a series of 30 evening radio addresses given by U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt between 1933 and 1944. The fireside chats represent the first time in history that a chief executive communicated directly with a large number of citizens. Roosevelt spoke with familiarity to millions of Americans about the banking crisis, the recession, New Deal initiatives, and the principal purposes and specific progress of World War II. On radio, he was able to quell rumors and explain his policies comprehensibly. His tone and demeanor communicated self-assurance during times of despair and uncertainty. Roosevelt was one of radio's greatest communicators, and the fireside chats kept him in high public regard throughout his presidency. The series of fireside chats was among the first 50 recordings made part of the National Recording Registry of the Library of Congress, which noted it as an influential series of radio broadcasts in which Roosevelt utilized the media to present his programs and ideas directly to the public and thereby redefined the relationship between the president and the American people. Origin. Roosevelt understood that his administration's success depended upon a favorable dialogue with the electorate possible only through methods of mass communication and that the true power of the presidency was the ability to take the initiative. The use of radio for direct appeals was perhaps the most important of FDR's innovations in political communication. Roosevelt unregistered trademark S opponents had control of most newspapers in the 1930s and press reports were under their control and involved their editorial commentary. Historian Betty Houchin Winfield says, he and his advisers worried that newspapers' biases would affect their news columns and rightly so. Historian Douglas B. Craig says that he offered voters a chance to receive information unadulterated by newspaper proprietors' bias through the new medium of radio. Roosevelt first used what would become known as fireside chats in 1929 as governor of New York. He faced a conservative Republican legislature, so during each legislative session he would occasionally address the residents of New York directly. His third gubernatorial address April 3, 1929, on WGY Radio is cited by Roosevelt biographer Frank Friedel as being the first fireside chat. In these speeches, Roosevelt appealed to radio listeners for help getting his agenda passed. Letters would pour in following each of these addresses, which helped pressure legislators to pass measures Roosevelt had proposed. As president, Roosevelt began making the informal addresses on March 12, 1933, 8 days after his inauguration. He had spent his first week coping with a month-long epidemic of bank closings that was ruining families nationwide. He closed the entire American banking system on March 6. On March 9 Congress passed the Emergency Banking Act, which Roosevelt used to effectively create federal deposit insurance when the banks reopened. At 10 p.m. Eastern Time that Sunday night, on the eve of the end of the bank holiday, Roosevelt spoke to a radio audience of more than 60 million people, to tell them in clear language, what has been done in the last few days, why it was done, and what the next steps are going to be. The result, according to economic historian William L. Silber, was a remarkable turnaround in the public's confidence. The contemporary press confirms that the public recognized the implicit guarantee and, as a result, believed that the reopened banks would be safe, as the president explained in his first fireside chat. Within 2 weeks people returned more than half of the cash they had been hoarding, and the first stock trading day after the bank holiday marked the largest ever one-day percentage price increase. The term fireside chat was inspired by a statement by Roosevelt's press secretary, Stephen Early, who said that the president liked to think of the audience as a few people seated around his fireside. Listeners were able to picture FDR in his study, in front of the fireplace, and could imagine they were sitting beside him. The term was coined by CBS broadcast executive Harry C. Butcher of the network's Washington, D.C., office, in a press release before the address of May 7, 1933. The phrase has often been credited to CBS journalist Robert Trout, but he said he was simply the first person to use it on the air. The title was picked up by the press and public and later used by Roosevelt himself, becoming part of American folklore. Presentation. Roosevelt customarily made his address from the diplomatic reception room of the White House. He would arrive 15 minutes before airtime to welcome members of the press, including radio and newsreel correspondents. NBC White House announcer Carlton E. Smith gave him a simple introduction: "Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States." Roosevelt most often began his talks with the words, "My friends," or "My fellow Americans," and he read his speech from a loose-leaf binder. Presidential advisor and speechwriter Samuel Rosenman recalled his use of common analogies and his care in avoiding dramatic oratory. He looked for words that he would use in an informal conversation with one or two of his friends. 80% of the words used were in the 1,000 most commonly used words in the English language. It was the first time in history that a large segment of the population could listen directly to a chief executive, wrote radio historian John Dunning, and the chats are often credited with helping keep Roosevelt's popularity high. Each radio address went through about a dozen drafts. Careful attention was also given to Roosevelt's delivery. When he realized that a slight whistle was audible on the air due to a separation between his two front lower teeth, FDR had a removable bridge made. FDR is regarded as one of the most effective communicators in radio history. Although the fireside chats are sometimes thought of as weekly events, Roosevelt delivered just 30 addresses during a presidency lasting 4,422 days. He resisted those who encouraged him to speak on radio more frequently, as shown in his response to Russell Leffingwell after the address February 23, 1942, "The one thing I dread is that my talks should be so frequent as to lose their effectiveness. Every time I talk over the air it means 4 or 5 days of long, overtime work in the preparation of what I say. Actually, I cannot afford to take this time away from more vital things. I think we must avoid too much personal leadership. My good friend Winston Churchill has suffered a little from this." Gallery == Chronological list of addresses. Reception. Roosevelt's radio audiences averaged 18% during peacetime, and 58% during the war. The fireside chats attracted more listeners than the most popular radio shows, which were heard by 35% of the radio audience. Roosevelt's fireside chat of December 29, 1940, was heard by 59% of radio listeners. His address of May 27, 1941, was heard by 70% of the radio audience. An estimated 62,100,000 people heard Roosevelt's fireside chat December 9, 1941, attaining a Hooper rating of 79, the record high for a presidential address. Approximately 61,365,000 adults tuned in February 23, 1942, for FDR's first fireside chat since the attack on Pearl Harbor, in which he outlined the principal purposes of the war. In advance of the address, Roosevelt asked citizens to have a world map in front of them as they listened to him speak. "I'm going to speak about strange places that many of them never heard of, places that are now the battleground for civilization," he told his speechwriters. "I want to explain to the people something about geography, what our problem is and what the overall strategy of the war has to be. If they understand the problem and what we are driving at, I am sure that they can take any kind of bad news right on the chin." Sales of new maps and atlases were unprecedented, while many people retrieved old commercial maps from storage and pinned them up on their walls. The New York Times called the speech one of the greatest of Roosevelt's career. Novelist Saul Bellow recalled hearing a fireside chat while walking in Chicago one summer evening. The blight hadn't yet carried off the elms, and under them drivers had pulled over, parking bumper to bumper, and turned on their radios to hear Roosevelt. They had rolled down the windows and opened the car doors. Everywhere the same voice, its odd Eastern accent, which in anyone else would have irritated Midwesterners. Who could follow without missing a single word as you strolled by. You felt joined to these unknown drivers, men and women smoking their cigarettes in silence, not so much considering the president's words as affirming the rightness of his tone and taking assurance from it. This level of intimacy with politics made people feel as if they too were part of the administration's decision-making process, and many soon felt that they knew Roosevelt personally. Most importantly, they grew to trust him. The conventional press grew to love Roosevelt because they too had gained unprecedented access to the goings-on of government. Legacy. Every U.S. president since Roosevelt has delivered periodic addresses to the American people, first on radio, and later adding television and the Internet. The practice of regularly scheduled addresses began in 1982 when President Ronald Reagan started delivering a radio broadcast every Saturday. Accolades. The series of Roosevelt's 30 Fireside Chats was included with the first 50 recordings made part of the National Recording Registry of the Library of Congress. It is noted as an influential series of radio broadcasts in which Roosevelt utilized the media to present his programs and ideas directly to the public and thereby redefined the relationship between the president and the American people. Further reading. Craig, Douglas B. Fireside Politics, Radio and Political Culture in the United States, 1920–1940. Baltimore, Johns Hopkins University Press, 2000. ISBN 9780801883125, Foster, Tiara K. Constructing a World War II America, The Rhetorical Craftsmanship of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Ph.D. dissertation. Syracuse University, 2013. Hayes, Joy Elizabeth. 2000. Did Herbert Hoover broadcast the first Fireside Chat? Rethinking the Origins of Roosevelt's Radio Genius. Journal of Radio Studies 7, No. 1, 76/92. ISSN 1095-5046, Q, Amos. FDR's First Fireside Chat, Public Confidence and the Banking Crisis. College Station, Texas A&M University Press, 2007. ISBN 9781585445974, Levine, Lawrence W., and Cornelia Levine. The Fireside Conversations, America Responds to FDR During the Great Depression. Berkeley, University of California Press, 2010. ISBN 9780520265547, Lim, Elvin T. 2003. The Lion and the Lamb, Demythologizing Franklin Roosevelt's Fireside Chats. Rhetoric and Public Affairs 6 No. 3, 437/464. ISSN 1094-8392, Ryan, Harford Ross. Franklin D. Roosevelt's Rhetorical Presidency. New York, Greenwood Press, 1988. ISBN 9780313255670, Rife, David Michael 2001. From Media and Audience to Media Public, A Study of Letters Written in Reaction to FDR's Fireside Chats. Media, Culture and Society 23 No. 6, 767-781. Rife, David Michael 1999. Franklin Roosevelt and the Fireside Chats. Journal of Communication 49 No. 4, 80-103. ISSN 0021-9916, Winfield, Betty Harchin. FDR in the News Media. Urbana, University of Illinois Press, 1990. ISBN 9780252016721. References. External links, The New Deal Network from the Roosevelt Institute, The Real Deal, Media and the Battle to Define Roosevelt Social Programs at the University of Virginia, audio with editorial and cartoon reactions. Vincent Voice Library at Michigan State University, with many Roosevelt speeches in MP3 format.